Great. Thank you so much for that great introduction, and thank you for the Weizenbaum-Institut for inviting me to speak on this. As Elka mentioned, I'm a former data scientist from Meta, and as we start to think about researchers getting access to data sets from the platform, that means that you are all going to be introduced, hopefully, you are all going to be introduced to the nightmarishly messy and convoluted internal, means that the platforms have of storing that data, right? It's a bit of a jungle internally, even when you're there. One of my jokes when I was a data scientist at Meta was that most of my job is actually data archaeology, right? It's digging through all the data that the company has, figuring out when this data set was made, if it's actually accurate, is it even still relevant? Hopefully the person who made it still works at the company. I can ask them questions, but then they probably didn't. So you're kind of left with like the rubble of it. So a quick background on the Integrity Institute. So yeah, as mentioned, we're kind of part professional community, part think tank. On the professional community side, we now have over 500 members, all of whom have experience working at a social media company or a social internet company on an integrity team or trust and safety team or related problem. And we're trying to harness all of that experience and expertise and connect it to the outside world, which means, a lot of work with policymakers, but also academics. So a quick outline of the talk, and this talk is going to roughly follow a paper that we put out in collaboration with Edmo, written by Matt Motel, Spencer Gurley, myself, and Sophia Bonilla. So if you want to read the full report, you can catch it there. But roughly, I'll be covering what data do platforms collect, what they don't collect, how that data is organized internally. I'll do a quick case study on Mastodon, so using an open source platform as a sort of playground to see what kind of data platforms typically have. And then finally, a little bit of an exercise of trying to map raw data to questions about systemic risks. So first off, what data do platforms collect? They collect a lot of data, right? And there's this typical kind of cliche of the platforms just sucking up all the data that they ever come across and they ever come into contact with. And that's not entirely true, but it's also not entirely inaccurate, right? And so we broke it down into a handful of different types of categories of data that platforms collect. So first off, platforms obviously collect data that is provided by the user. And so this would be like consciously shared. So the user in making an account said, this is my age, and this is the country I live in, and this is my name. There's also data that is extracted from the user, right? And this isn't necessarily consciously shared, but this could include device IDs, IP addresses, contacts in their phone. So these are things that maybe the user isn't explicitly telling the platform, but through one way or another, because of the interaction, the platform gets that data. There is data that is created by the users. And so this could be like on-platform content. So obviously, if you make a post on a particular platform, that platform is going to have access to the post and that content in the post. There's also behavioral data. And so this is generated by users and their activity and interaction with the platform. So this would be, what are the content that they see? What do they engage with? How much time are they spending on the platform, et cetera? Now, if you're thinking about a particular user, you will also get data about that user from other users, right? So you'll be able to see, who has viewed their profile, who has blocked them, who has engaged with them, things like that. There's also a lot of inferred data. And so these might be predicted properties of a user. So this typically is like predicting what a user is interested in, what topics they are interested in. But you can also predict demographic data, such as predicting age. You can predict if this user is likely to violate policies in the future. And finally, there is data that platforms can purchase, right? So of course, there is the data broker market, and platforms can buy data from the data broker market just like anyone else can. And so this is where you can start getting into data about like how much income does the person have, what's their consumer behavior, things like that. Why do they collect all this data? Largely because it's in their business interest too, right? There's three broad reasons. So first is that the data is inherently required for the platform experience, right? So that'd be like the content you create, they need an email to email you. There's stuff that they just need to collect for the platform to operate. The next big reason is for advertising revenue, of course. So the more data a platform has, they can offer more and better targeting opportunities to advertiser. And so that's with better targeting data, then that means each ad impression is worth more money. So they get paid more per ad impression. And the final is sort of tailoring the user experience. And here, more data that you have around a user, the more customization you can do and personalization for their platform experience to try to get them to stay on the platform longer, right? So this would be get them to see more ads, in the long run in terms of like, what's the bottom line business reason for this? So for example, if an advertiser wants to target wealthy new parents, they'll have to stitch together different pieces of data that they get in these different buckets, right? So maybe the users tell them the age, right? And so you can say, this person is in their mid 20s to early 30s, right? The content that the user engages with will be relevant. So, this person liked a post about being a new parent or liked a post about, babies. And then external data sources, right? So you actually might know like, here's a list of emails and, what credit card companies think their income is. And so you can say, so they seem like they're wealthy. So that's just an example. But that being said, just because the platforms have a ton of data doesn't mean they have all of the data. And it especially means that their data isn't necessarily perfect, right? So for example, age. There's lots of platforms that don't actually ask the user their age when they sign up for it, right? Instagram for a very long time never asked anyone what their age was. And so if you go to a platform that hasn't been collecting people's age and you say, I want to study what kinds of content that, 21-year-olds are seeing on your platform. Well, you might get a response back that's like, well, we don't actually know what everyone's age is, right? And we don't know everyone's age perfectly. And so we're going to have to start getting introduced to like speaking around like the nuances here and understand how that particular platform thinks about age, right? So there might be like a predicted age for the platform or a probability of being in a particular age range. There's some data that platforms might explicitly be avoiding, right? So political party affiliation, for example, platforms collecting that could be problematic. It could lead to a lot of backlash, right? And so if you want to know, what do people in this particular party, what types of content are they seeing on the platform? That actually might be something that they really can't help with from a genuine point of view. There might be content topics that aren't explicitly known. So, when you're on the inside, it's actually hard to say, what is all the political content that people are looking at? Like, well, what is political content? And you have to have classifiers that are saying, the degree to which it might be or might not be political. So like that can be very tricky. And then of course, like inauthentic accounts and, FEMI accounts, right? Ideally, it would be very great to go to a platform and say, I would like all the content from, accounts that are part of foreign influence operations. But that determination, if an account is inauthentic or might be part of a foreign influence operation, that can also be probabilistic, right? So understanding that, you might have to say, like, does this platform have the means of predicting if an account is part of a foreign influence operation? And then I would like to see content that is above some certain threshold of confidence rather than definitively from a foreign influence operation. And then, of course, there's lots of rumors, right? So it's like, are all the platforms listening to everything you say? And so, if you have that data set, that's not going to exist. Okay, so how is all this data organized internally? And so here, like, I'm sure some of you might actually be data engineers, and so this might be a little bit boring, but there's a lot of data engineering that researchers in general are going to have to learn because this is how it's used inside of the company. So inside, data is actually extremely chaotic. There's entire company functions that are dedicated to just managing all the data that the platform has. So you'll have data engineering teams, analytics teams, data science teams, and when you're inside of the companies, any one of these people can just make a new data set, right? And then like throw it into the data warehouse and have it live on there. And so people do that. And so you do have this enormous ecosystem, this huge jungle of different data sets that exist internally. So even though it is quite chaotic, there's a couple of like principles that are used in data engineering that can be kind of useful. And so one common framework is the idea of fact tables and dimension tables. So a dimension table collects a large amount of information about a single object or entity inside of the platform. And so here, each row in a dimension table would represent a single instance of an object. So over here, as an example, we have like what a user table might look like. And so here you might have different columns, so like the user ID, the user's name, the email, etc. And then in this data set, each row would be a distinct individual user and all the data that the platform has around that user. Fact tables are generally ones that collect facts about events that occur on the platform. And so each row in a fact table will be a different occurrence of something, and so it's kind of like a verb, right? And so here's like an example event table or fact table that might be related to a content feed. So you have, the user ID column, the event ID, and then the post ID. And so this might collect all the different events that occur between users and posts on the platform. So a user liked a post and a user viewed a different post. And all this gets combined into what is called a star schema. And so the star schema kind of works where you have a central fact table that might be collecting all events that are occurring on the platform. But that fact table will rely on different dimension tables. So the fact table has a user ID that connects to the user dimension table and has a session ID that connects to the different session table and has a post ID that connects to the post dimension table. So, the fact tables are collecting together all the different events in the event log. But a lot of the details of that, like the fact table, collects every single event, and many, many billions of events are occurring per day. So you want to keep that trim and slim down. And so, there won't be a single table that's like, here's every post that a 25-year-old saw, but it gives you the log table will give you, here's all the views, here's the user ID of those views. So you can go collect that data from a different table and join them together. So as an example, what might this look like if you're trying to predict how many violating, or predicts the likelihood that a particular post violates a content policy, right? Predicting if a post violates a content policy does require a whole lot of data, right? So first there's the content itself, and that might come from a post dimension table. There's the account that posted it, right? That will come from a user dimension table. And then there will be user responses, right? And so that will depend upon aggregations from the fact table. So you can kind of see you need to pull together all these different pieces of data from all these different tables, and then join them together. All right, so you can see that very quickly, like if you say, I need a data set that has this column and that column and that column, there's a decent chance that that data table doesn't exist inside of the platform, right? You're gonna have to be going to many different tables to grab different pieces of that and then stitch them together and ship it. And so it's important to keep this in mind, like as you communicate with the platforms and discuss about what they do and don't have, right? You could definitely imagine a situation where a platform is saying, oh, we don't have that exact data table with those exact columns in it. But they do have that data spread out among many different data tables. So you just have to be able to communicate to them that they need to stitch it together. But if you wanted to predict violating posts, all this different data could be stitched together into a feature table. That feature table then feeds a classifier, which is trained on it. And then you have a data table that stores the output scores. And this would be like a dimension table where you have like post ID, and here's the probability that it violates a particular policy. So we can look at Mastodon as sort of an interesting example of, what's a nice playground where we can understand this better. There's open source platforms, they generate data tables, and Mastodon is a pretty interesting one. It acts kind of as a minimal stand-in for maybe a VLOP, right? Because Mastodon does sort of have a philosophy of not collecting any data that isn't unnecessary for the operation of the platform. So you can kind of sort of operate under the assumption that like, if Mastodon is collecting a particular piece of data, it's almost certain, that the VLOPs are collecting that data or something very similar to it. But when you look at Mastodon, they actually do have dimension and fact tables. And so it actually does have a kind of star schema under the hood where you have statuses, which are sort of the posts. You have, reports, right? So the reports, actually every report of a piece of content goes into a table. You have account tables. And then all of those kind of get stitched together into an events log that you can see in the logging of it. We can compare what is, so So we can look at all the different fields that Mastodon is collecting, and we can compare this to the data that the APIs are currently giving us, right? So this would be like the 4012 APIs. And so if you were interested in studying, foreign influence, FEMI type study, you might be really interested in like the text of the actual content of posts, how much engagement they're getting, if they're getting reported at all, if there's any classifier scores under them. And you can see from Mastodon, actually, you can get pretty much everything that you might want to answer questions around FEMA on the platform. But from the different platforms, for Facebook, X, and TikTok, right, it's kind of hit or miss. So it's nice to have Mastodon here to be like, well, like, you certainly have reports tables internally at TikTok and Facebook. So what are the aggregate, stats that you need from it? Answer your question. And then finally, tables useful for systemic risk. So as a data scientist from Meta, one of the tables that I'm really, really excited for researchers to get access to, one of the questions that I would really love researchers to be able to answer en masse is, what is the prevalence of various types of harms on the platform? And what I mean by that is, if there's a particular type of harmful content that you're concerned about, what fraction of all impressions on content are related to that harm, right? Currently, it's platform policies, or it's platforms that get to say, this is our policy, this is our content policy. They determine what violates it or what doesn't violate it. And then only some of them, right? So only Meta and YouTube currently tell us what is the prevalence of the violation on the content, right? So Meta does actually put out a report. Meta and YouTube put a report every quarter that is like, this quarter, 0.02% of impressions on content violated our hate speech policies, right? That's great. They don't have to tell us that data, so I'm glad that they do. But it would also be really great for external researchers to be able to validate that number, right? Like, can we actually trust it? Will we be able to trust it going forward? What are they missing? What are they not missing? Are there systemic problems across countries? So would love to be able to, for you all to get access to the kinds of data tables that would let you repeat those measurements. And so here is an example of how you might be able to get it, right? So the ideal data set to answer these kind of questions would be randomly sampling impressions of content on the platform, right? So you kind of randomly sample, 10,000 impressions of content on the platform. You send that content off to be labeled for whatever type of harm you're concerned about. And then you see, okay, here's which fraction violated or, were concerning or harmful. And so the core table that you're going to want is it'll be a fact table of like user impressions on the platform, right? So you randomly select the views and then you can evaluate them for a problem. We would love to be able to add extra dimensions to this, right? So it could be like country or age. And so there you would take the impressions log, you would join that with the user table to be able to filter out, okay, here's different age buckets and impressions in different countries. So then you could actually say, okay, not just here's the impressions on pro-eating disorder content around the world, you could say, here's the prevalence of pro-eating disorder content on teens in Germany, right? And then finally, you really want to be able to do what's called stratified random sampling, which lets you get, because obviously the prevalence of harms is quite low on the platform, like 0.02% impressions on hate speech. So that means you'd have to sample, about 10,000 pieces of content to get on average 2. So stratified random sampling is what they do internally. And basically it upsamples content that is likely to be violating. And so you could join with a reports table to be like, okay, we would like to upsample content that has a lot of reports on it because that's probably where the violations live. And so if you combine all this together, we could actually have public researchers that are vetting the numbers that we're getting from the platforms today, which would be great. So quick conclusion and recap. Again, all this is in the paper, so you can collect it there. But platforms collect a ton of data, but they're also not going to have perfect data for everything that you would like. Understanding how the platform data is stored will be useful, right? Particularly in navigating conversations with the platform about, do they actually have what you need? Do they not have what you need? There are open source platforms that you can point to, right? To kind of understand how platforms are storing data internally. Mastodon is a really great example. I have ideas about how to do this for Elasticsearch, which will let you understand what is the kind of logging that a ranking system would produce, because Elasticsearch is an open source ranking system. And, hopefully we're getting, real answers, real access that lets us answer questions about systemic risks. And if we do get there, there are actually platform experts that can help you all. So, the Integrity Institute is here, and we are definitely interested in making sure that academics are getting the exact kind of data that they need to answer the questions. So we're happy to help with your requests. And that's it. Thank you.